Only two men in the entire Bible never died. One was taken before the Great Flood. The other is him. But if you think he was a fearless superhero with a heart of steel, you are entirely wrong. Before he rode a chariot of fire into the stars, he was a broken man, sitting in the desert dirt, begging for his story to end. But this isn't just the story of a man who challenged a fake storm god. You will see a desert wanderer fed by wild birds, a starving family saved by an endless jar, and one man standing alone against hundreds of false prophets in the ultimate showdown of fire. Stay with us till the end to discover how God's greatest power isn't found in the earthquake, but in a whisper. If these stories connect with you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us bring more of these biblical epics to life. Now, let's begin. King Ahab ruled from an ivory throne in the capital city of Samaria. He cared more about his wealth than his people. But the true terror in the palace was his wife, Queen Jezebel. She had come from a foreign land, bringing her false gods with her. She forced an entire nation to their knees, begging a terrifying, silent statue of wood and stone to send them rain. The real prophets? Hunted, silenced, hiding in the dark. She did not just want her gods to be welcomed. She wanted the God of Israel completely erased. She had sent heavily armed soldiers across the hills, tearing down altars and silencing anyone who dared speak the true name of the Lord. The streets were choked with the thick smoke of pagan sacrifices. The kingdom desperately needed a hero. But God didn't send a shiny knight or a wealthy prince. Instead, deep in the rocky, barren hills of Gilead, God chose an absolute nobody. His name was Elijah. He was a rough wilderness man from the small town of Tishbe, wearing a heavy camel hair coat, which was the ultimate symbol of a prophet's divine authority and power. He didn't have a fancy education or royal manners, but he had a fire in his heart, an unbreakable faith, and a direct message from heaven. His steps were not hurried, but they carried weight. Leaving the wilderness behind, he walked straight into the palace halls. This was the terrifying, heavily guarded fortress Elijah had just boldly invaded. Guards glanced at one another in confusion, yet no one dared to draw a sword. His very presence commanded absolute silence without a single word. Standing before the golden throne, the dusty prophet from Gilead didn't just challenge their fake god. He delivered a divine curse.
As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word.
As the words left his mouth, the atmosphere in the throne room shattered. Ahab was completely stunned. Jezebel was furious.
Guards, seize this wild man immediately!
But before the royal soldiers could even draw their swords, Elijah turned and walked out. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The guards parted ways, entirely unable to step forward and stop him. It was as if an invisible shield surrounded the prophet. He walked out of the city gates just as freely as he had walked in. Behind him, the sky began to change. The clouds dissolved. The air turned dry and crisp. The heavens slammed shut. The drought had officially begun. Queen Jezebel was not going to let him get away. She immediately dispatched hunting parties to track him down. Elijah was now the most wanted fugitive in the kingdom. As Elijah hurried away from the capital, the voice of the Lord came to him, clear and directing.
Leave this place Go to the east and hide by the Cherith brook, near where it enters the Jordan River. Drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I have commanded them to bring you food.
I hear your voice, Lord. I will leave this place immediately and trust you in the wilderness.
Elijah did not question the command. He traveled far off the main roads, avoiding the king's searching patrols. He descended deep into a steep, hidden stone canyon. The brook of Chariot was a quiet, isolated place surrounded by towering rock walls. It was a place where nobody would ever think to look for him. The silence of the canyon was absolute. There were no soldiers, no king, no danger, just the sound of cool water rushing over smooth stones. And then the true wonder began. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in bright orange and deep purple, a strange sound echoed from above. The flapping of wings. A flock of dark, mysterious ravens descended from the sky. These were wild scavenger birds, known for taking food, not giving it. But they landed gently on the rocks right beside Elijah. In their beaks, they carried fresh, warm bread and pieces of cooked meat. They dropped the food at his feet, let out a soft call, and flew back into the evening sky.
Thank you, Lord. You are faithful, even in the middle of nowhere.
Morning and evening, the ravens returned. They brought enough food to sustain him day after day, week after week. Elijah would sit on the canyon floor, eating the bread and drinking the clear, cold water from the brook. It was a beautiful, quiet season of deep trust. But outside the canyon, the world was suffering. The drought had gripped the entire nation. The green fields of Israel turned brown and cracked. Rivers turned into thick, dry mud. The wealthy merchants began to panic, and the poor began to go hungry. King Ahab's soldiers scoured every neighboring country, violently demanding they hand over the prophet who had cursed their weather. But Elijah remained perfectly hidden. Eventually, the severe lack of rain reached the hidden canyon. Elijah woke up one morning and noticed the sound of the rushing water was much quieter. The brook was shrinking. The rocks that were normally underwater were now baking in the sun. He watched patiently as the water level dropped day by day. He did not panic. He did not complain. He knew the God who sent the ravens was watching the water line too. Finally, the stream slowed to a tiny trickle, and then the riverbed turned completely to dry mud. The water was gone. Elijah waited for his next instruction. The absolute silence of the dry canyon was broken by the familiar, comforting voice of the Lord.
Go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you.
Elijah stood up and gathered his rough coat. The instruction was incredible for two very dangerous reasons. First, Zarephath was in a foreign land. It was the absolute heartland of Baal worship. Second, it was the exact region where Queen Jezebel had grown up. God was sending his most wanted prophet straight into the enemy's backyard, and he was sending him to be protected by a poor, starving widow. The journey was brutal. Elijah walked for miles across the cracked, ruined earth. The sun beat down relentlessly. The dust swirled in the hot wind, stinging his eyes. When he finally approached the wooden gates of Zarephath, his throat was completely parched. He was exhausted. Near the town gate, he saw a woman. She was dressed in worn, faded clothes, leaning over to pick up dry sticks from the dusty road. Her face looked incredibly tired, carrying the heavy, hollow expression of someone who had completely given up. Elijah knew instantly that this was the woman God had chosen.
Excuse me. Would you please bring me a little water in a cup?
The woman stopped. She looked at the dusty traveler. Without arguing, she nodded slowly and turned to head toward the town well. Water was incredibly rare, but she was willing to share.
And please, could you bring me a bite of bread too?
I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die.
The absolute despair in her voice was heartbreaking. The famine had stolen everything from her. She was preparing for the very end.
Don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you've said, but make a little bread for me first.
Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son.
But I just told you, there is absolutely nothing left to feed my own child.
For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land.
The widow stared at the prophet. It was an outrageous promise, but there was something so calm and so certain in his voice that she decided to take the greatest risk of her life. She invited Elijah into her small, humble home. Her young son watched quietly from the corner. She went to the clay jar. She scraped the very last handful of flour from the bottom. She tipped the jug and let the final few drops of oil fall into the bowl. She mixed the dough, baked a small warm loaf of bread over the fire, and handed it to Elijah. Then, holding her breath, she walked back to the clay jar to look inside.
This is absolutely impossible. I scraped the very bottom of this jar myself.
What is it, Mother? Why are you crying? Is something wrong with the bread?
Look, the jar has flour in it again.
And the jug?
The jug feels completely full.
She poured more oil. It flowed smoothly into her bowl. She scooped out more flour. The jar did not empty. Laughter filled the small house for the first time in months. She quickly baked more bread, and the three of them ate a joyful, miraculous feast. Day after day, the miracle continued. Every time she reached into the jar, there was enough flour for the day. Every time she tipped the jug, the golden oil flowed. Outside her door, the city of Zarephath was starving. But inside her home, there was warmth, provision, and absolute wonder. God was taking care of them, one single day at a time. But the peace of that little house was about to be shattered. Sometime later, the widow's son grew very sick. A sudden, terrible fever swept through his small body. His mother placed cool cloths on his forehead, but his breathing became weaker and weaker. Within a few hours, the terrible illness took him. The boy closed his eyes and stopped breathing entirely. The widow was completely devastated. The grief overwhelmed her, turning her deep sadness into sudden anger. She carried her lifeless son to Elijah.
Oh, man of God, what have you done to me? Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son?
Please give your son to me. Let me carry him upstairs and seek the Lord's mercy.
Elijah's heart broke. He did not argue with her anger. He gently took the boy from her arms, carried him up the stairs to the guest room where he had been staying, and laid the child carefully on the bed. Elijah felt entirely helpless. He dropped to his knees and cried out to the heavens.
O Lord my God, why have you brought tragedy to this widow who has opened her home to me, causing her son to die?"
Then the prophet did something highly unusual. He stretched himself out over the child's body 3 times, as if trying to pour his own life energy into the boy, and he prayed with a desperate, roaring faith.
"O Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him."
He waited. The room was perfectly silent. Then, a tiny sound. A gasp of air. The boy's chest rose. His eyes fluttered open. He looked up at Elijah and blinked. The warmth returned to his face. The boy was alive. Elijah scooped the child up into his arms, overwhelmed with joy. He hurried down the wooden stairs. The widow was sitting on the floor, her face buried in her hands.
Look at him! The Lord has heard my prayer. Your son is alive and breathing.
The widow gasped. She leaped to her feet and grabbed her boy, hugging him so tightly she spun him around the room. Tears of absolute joy streamed down her face. She looked at Elijah, her previous anger completely replaced by a permanent, unshakable faith.
Now I know for sure that you are a man of God, and that the Lord truly speaks through you.
The drought raged on outside, but inside that home, death had been defeated. God had proven that his power was not limited to the weather. He was the Lord of life itself. 3 full, agonizing years had passed since the rain stopped. The beautiful land of Israel looked like a barren, cracked desert. The streams were nothing but dust. The crops were completely gone. The people were desperate, and the animals were starving. Finally, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the middle of the quiet house in Zarephath.
Go and present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain.
Elijah gathered his things, said a fond goodbye to the widow and her son, and began the long, dangerous walk back into the heart of the kingdom. King Ahab had been frantically searching the countryside himself, desperately looking for any hidden springs of water to keep his royal horses and mules alive. When his royal guards told him that Elijah had been spotted walking boldly down the main highway, the king furiously mounted his chariot to meet him. The 2 men finally came face to face on a dry, dusty road. The king glared down from his grand chariot at the rough-looking prophet in the camel hair coat.
"Is it really you, the great troublemaker, who has brought this terrible curse upon all of Israel? I have made no trouble for Israel. You and your family are the troublemakers. For you have refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. Now, summon all of Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 405th prophets of Baal."
Ahab was taken aback by the absolute, unwavering authority in Elijah's voice. The king was desperate for rain, so without arguing, he sent royal messengers to every corner of the kingdom. A few days later, a massive, nervous crowd gathered at the very top of Mount Carmel. It was a staggering, cinematic sight. Thousands of regular citizens stood on the rocky slopes. On one side of the mountain stood the 450 false prophets. They wore elaborate, colorful robes, holding shiny staffs and chanting loudly. They looked incredibly confident, backed by the power of the throne. On the other side stood Elijah, one single man. Elijah walked forward, stepping between the false prophets and the people. The massive crowd fell completely silent, waiting to see what the legendary prophet would do.
"How much longer will you waver, hobbling between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, Then follow him.
The crowd stared at the ground. No one said a single word. They were too afraid of the queen's prophets to choose the truth.
I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left here, but Baal has 450 prophets. Bring us 2 bulls. Let them choose one, cut it into pieces,
and lay it on the wood of their altar without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other.
Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God. What you have spoken is fair. We agree to witness this test of fire.
The rules of the showdown were set. The false prophets went first. They prepared their grand altar, laid the meat on the wood, and began to pray. They chanted loudly, throwing their hands into the air, begging their storm god to send a simple spark.
Almighty Baal, hear our cries. Answer us and send the fire from the sky.
They danced wildly around the altar. Morning turned into noon. The blazing sun beat down, but there was no spark, no smoke, absolutely no answer. The crowd watched the embarrassing, exhausting display. Elijah leaned casually against a large rock, watching them sweat. He decided to have a little fun with them.
Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened.
The false prophets grew absolutely furious. They screamed at the top of their lungs. They danced faster and faster. They even drew their swords and started cutting themselves to show their god how serious they were. They kept up their frantic, bloody rituals all afternoon until they were completely out of breath and collapsing in the dirt. But the altar remained perfectly cold. Baal was nothing but a silent, empty lie. As the evening approached, the exhausted prophets finally gave up. Elijah stepped forward.
Come closer to me. Step forward and watch carefully what the Lord is about to do.
The crowd huddled closer, eager to see what would happen next. Elijah ignored the pagan altar entirely. Instead, he walked over to the ruins of an old altar of the Lord that had been violently torn down by Jezebel's soldiers. Carefully, respectfully, he picked up 12 heavy stones, one for each of the ancient tribes of Israel, and rebuilt the altar. He dug a wide, deep trench all the way around the base. He arranged the wood and placed the offering on top. Then, Elijah gave an order that made absolutely no sense during a massive 3-year drought.
Fill 4 massive jars with water and pour it completely over the offering and the wood.
The people whispered in extreme confusion. Every stream was dry. Every well was empty. To find water, they had to trek far down the steep mountain slopes to the distant sources below. But they obeyed. They hauled the heavy, sloshing jars back up the rocky heights, their muscles aching and their breath coming in gasps. They poured the precious liquid over the altar.
Do not stop yet. Go back, fill the jars, and do the exact same thing a second time.
Again, the people labored, carrying the weight of the water up the mountain. The wood was now completely soaked.
Soak it until it overflows. Do it a third time until the water floods the entire trench.
By the time they finished the 3rd trip, the water was running down the stones and filling the deep trench. It was a soggy, dripping mess. It would be entirely impossible to light this with a normal torch, let alone by a miracle. Elijah did not dance. He did not scream. He did not cut himself. He simply walked up to the wet altar, looked up to the clear blue sky, and spoke in a clear, carrying voice.
O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant.
Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you,
Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again.
He didn't even have to wait for the echo. Instantly, a blinding, roaring column of fire fell straight down from the open sky. It slammed into the altar with a massive shockwave. The heat was incredibly intense. The crowd shielded their eyes from the brilliant light. When they finally looked back, they gasped in absolute shock. The fire hadn't just burned the wood. It had entirely vaporized the sacrifice. It had burned the wet logs. It had melted the 12 heavy stones into ash. It had even licked up every single drop of water in the flooded trench. There was absolutely nothing left but a scorched, smoking crater in the ground. The massive crowd was terrified and overwhelmed with absolute awe. Thousands of people instantly fell flat on their faces, pressing their foreheads into the dirt.
the Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God! He alone is the true God of Israel, and we have been so blind.
The debate was permanently over. The truth was undeniable. Elijah ordered the massive awakened crowd to seize the false prophets of Baal. King Ahab was standing right there, but he was completely outnumbered and too terrified of the angry citizens to even try and stop them. The false prophets were taken down to the Kishon Valley to face ultimate justice. The spiritual drought was finally broken. Now, it was time to break the physical one. Elijah turned to King Ahab, who was still standing there, completely speechless and shaking.
Go get something to eat and drink, Ahab, for I already hear the heavy roar of a mighty rainstorm coming.
Ahab hurried off to his royal tent. The sky was still perfectly clear, but Elijah knew the absolute promise of God. He climbed higher up Mount Carmel, joined by a young servant. Elijah bowed down to the ground and began to pray.
Run to the edge of the cliff and look out toward the vast sea. Tell me what you see.
His young servant ran to the edge of the cliff, stared out at the sparkling ocean, and ran back.
I have looked across the entire horizon, Master, but there is absolutely nothing out there.
Do not give up so easily. Go back and look again, even if you must look 7 times.
The servant went back. 7 times he ran to the edge of the cliff. 7 times Elijah prayed faithfully in the dirt. Finally, on the 7th trip, the servant came sprinting back, totally out of breath and pointing at the sky.
Look! I saw a little cloud about the size of a man's hand finally rising from the sea.
Hurry! Run and tell King Ahab to hitch up his chariot and get down the mountain right now!
Before the heavy rain turns the valley to mud and completely traps him.
Within minutes, the sky grew black with massive rolling storm clouds. A fierce wind swept across the mountain, and then the heavy, wonderful sound of pouring rain began to wash over the dry, cracked earth. The 3-year drought was finally over. Ahab frantically whipped his horses, desperately trying to race the storm across the valley to his winter palace in the city of Jezreel. But then, something absolutely incredible happened. In those days, a king's greatest servants would run ahead of his chariot to announce his royal arrival. Elijah decided to give Ahab the greatest escort in history, but he was running to announce the victory of God. The supernatural power of the Lord came heavily upon Elijah. The prophet tucked his rough coat into his belt and took off running. With divine strength, he miraculously outran the king's fastest horses. He sprinted right past Ahab's royal chariot, acting as heaven's herald, racing through the pouring rain all the way to the city gates with a heart full of absolute victory. The heavy, miraculous rain battered the city of Jezreel. The dry, cracked earth was finally turning to thick, life-giving mud. The people were celebrating in their homes, listening to the wonderful sound of water pouring from the sky. The massive drought was officially over. King Ahab's royal chariot pulled into the palace courtyard. The king was soaked, out of breath, and shaken by what he had just witnessed on the mountain. He climbed the grand stone staircase and walked into the royal chambers. Queen Jezebel was waiting for him. She did not look relieved by the rain. She looked highly annoyed. Ahab stood before her and recounted every single detail of the day.
Elijah rebuilt the altar. He poured water all over it. And then fire fell straight out of the sky.
It burned the wood, the stones, the dust, and the water. The people bowed down.
They declared that his God is the true God. And then he destroyed all your prophets, every single one of them.
Jezebel did not gasp. She did not cry. She did not fall to her knees in repentance. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute fury. She refused to bow to a desert prophet.
Gods, bring me my fastest messenger right this instant.
A royal guard ran into the room, bowing quickly before the enraged queen.
Find Elijah. Deliver this message to him exactly as I say it. May the gods punish me, and punish me severely.
If by this time tomorrow I do not do to you exactly what you did to my prophets.
It was a direct, terrifying sentence. Jezebel knew she couldn't just execute him publicly while the crowds were still celebrating God's reign, so she used a different tactic. She wanted to terrify him into running away. Elijah was resting in the city, taking a breath after the greatest victory of his life. The spiritual war had been won. The rain had returned. He thought the nation would finally heal. He thought the king would change his ways. But then, the queen's messenger arrived and delivered the threat. It seems completely backward, doesn't it? How could a hero who just called down fire suddenly be so terrified? But Elijah was not a superhero. He was just a man. The adrenaline of the mountain had completely faded. His body was totally exhausted, and seeing that the wicked queen still held all the power, his spirit simply broke. It was fear. Real human fear. He looked around the city. The people were not rising up to defend him. Without seeking the Lord's direction, without waiting for a divine plan, Elijah turned and ran.
Pack your things quickly. We must leave the city right now.
Where are we going? The heavy storm is still raging.
Queen Jezebel has ordered my death. We must run for our lives.
Elijah was afraid. He and his young servant, the same boy who had watched the sky for rain, fled south. They ran as fast as they could to escape the borders of Israel. They pushed through the mud and the rocky hills, driving themselves to the limit until they finally reached the town of Beersheba, far down in the southern kingdom of Judah. But even there, Elisha did not feel safe. The fear had turned into a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. He left his young servant safely in the town and walked entirely alone into the barren desert. He walked for an entire day under the blazing sun. His muscles ached, his chest felt heavy, and a dark cloud of sadness settled over his mind. He had given absolutely everything to the mission, and it felt like it had all been for nothing. He finally collapsed under the thin, fragile shade of a scrawny desert bush called a broom tree. He leaned his back against the rough wood, closed his eyes, and poured out his broken heart to God.
I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died.
It was the desperate plea of a man who had hit rock bottom. He was convinced that he had failed. He was tired of fighting. He was tired of running. He simply wanted it all to be over. Elijah curled up in the dirt under the small bush and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. God did not send a lightning bolt to scold him. God did not deliver a loud, booming lecture about being brave. God knew exactly what his tired prophet needed. A glowing heavenly figure appeared in the harsh, empty landscape. It was an angel of the Lord. A gentle hand reached out and touched Elijah's shoulder.
Wake up, Elijah. You need to get up and eat.
Elijah slowly opened his heavy eyes, blinking against the divine light. Right next to his head, resting on some hot stones, was a freshly baked loaf of bread. Beside it sat a jar of cool, clear water. He sat up, amazed. He ate the warm bread, drank the water, and immediately lay back down in the dirt, falling asleep again. The exhaustion was simply too deep. Sometime later, the angel of the Lord returned. The angel touched his shoulder a second time, incredibly gentle, but firm.
Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you.
Elijah sat up. He ate the second meal prepared by heaven. The bread brought a strange, supernatural warmth to his body. His strength returned. His mind cleared. He stood up, brushed the desert dust off his camel hair coat, and began to walk. The food provided by the angel sustained him for 40 days and 40 nights as he traveled deeper into the ancient wilderness. He was heading for a very specific destination. He was walking toward the mountain of God. Mount Horeb was a massive, jagged peak rising out of the desert floor. It was the exact same mountain where Moses had seen the burning bush centuries ago. Now another tired prophet had arrived, desperately seeking answers. Elijah found a dark cave carved into the mountain. He sat in the total darkness, waiting for God to speak. The absolute silence was finally broken by a familiar voice.
Elijah, my faithful servant, what are you doing hiding here in this cave?
I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty. But the people of Israel have broken their covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too.
Go out and stand before me on the mountain, for the Lord is about to pass by.
Elijah stepped onto the rocky ledge. Suddenly, the sky turned violent. A terrifying wind slammed into the mountain, shattering massive boulders. But as Elijah listened to the howling wind, he realized the Lord was not in the wind. Then the ground beneath his boots violently shook. An earthquake rumbled deep within the stone, knocking him to his knees. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Finally, a brilliant, blinding fire swept across the rocky peak. The flames roared with intense heat. But even in the blazing fire, the Lord was not there. Why did God show him this? Elijah thought God only worked in massive, terrifying, destructive ways, just like the fiery showdown on Mount Carmel. But God was teaching him a profound lesson. The creator of the universe doesn't always use loud, flashy displays of power to change the world. The flames vanished. The mountain fell completely still. And then, out of the silence, came a sound. It was a gentle, quiet whisper, a soft murmur, like the lightest breeze. It was incredibly quiet, yet it carried an authority that commanded the entire universe. Elijah recognized it instantly and listened to the absolute beauty of that quiet voice.
Go back the way you came and travel to the wilderness of Damascus. You must anoint Hazael as king of Aram and Elisha to replace you as my prophet. And know this, I will preserve 7,000 others in Israel who have never bowed down to Baal.
7,000. Elijah was completely stunned. While he had been running for his life, convinced he was the only faithful person left on earth, God had been quietly protecting a massive army of believers. They were everyday people, quietly refusing to bow to the fake statues. Elijah smiled under his coat. He was not alone. He had never been alone. With a renewed spirit and a clear set of directions, Elijah walked down the mountain. He had a brand new mission, and he knew exactly who he needed to find. The farming town of Abel-Meholah was bustling. In the largest field, a wealthy young man named Elisha was guiding a massive wooden plow pulled by 12 pairs of strong oxen. He had a secure, comfortable future. He had no idea the most famous man in Israel was walking right toward him. Elijah strode onto the freshly plowed dirt. He didn't say a single word. He didn't even introduce himself. He simply took off his heavy camel hair coat and threw it right over Elisha's shoulders. The heavy mantle landed with a thud. Elisha completely froze. He recognized the famous prophet instantly, and he knew exactly what the coat meant. He remembered that it was the ultimate symbol of divine authority. By placing his mantle on Elisha, Elijah was speaking a silent language. He was officially passing the baton, calling the young farmer to take his place as the next prophet of God. Elisha snapped out of his shock, left his oxen in the dirt, and sprinted after the prophet.
First, let me go and kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will go with you. Go back if you must, but think carefully about what I have just done to you.
Elijah was testing him. He was giving Elisha an easy out. The young man could easily go back to his wealthy family. Being a prophet was incredibly dangerous. It meant confronting kings and living in the wilderness. Elisha looked at his massive farm, then looked at the rough mantle. He made his choice. He didn't just politely walk away. He completely destroyed his safety net. He chopped his wooden plow into pieces and built a massive bonfire right in the middle of the field. He sacrificed the oxen and spent the rest of the afternoon roasting the meat over his burning tools. That evening, he called his family and the entire village over for a massive farewell feast. It was a night filled with joyful stories and heavy tears. By burning his plows, Elisha was guaranteeing he could never change his mind and go back to his old life.
Thank you for everything you have given me, Mother and Father. But the Lord is calling me, and I must follow.
When the long feast finally ended, Elisha hugged his weeping parents tightly. He walked away from his wealthy inheritance, caught up with Elijah on the dusty road, and became his faithful student. Several years passed. Elijah and his new student Elisha stayed perfectly hidden in the wilderness, while King Ahab got completely distracted fighting foreign wars. The immediate danger faded, but the wicked heart of the king remained exactly the same. Ahab was resting in his winter palace in the city of Jezreel. Right next to the royal grounds was a beautiful, flourishing vineyard. It belonged to a faithful man named Naboth. The vineyard had been in his family for generations, protected by the ancient laws of God. Ahab looked out his window and decided he wanted it. He didn't want it for anything important. He just wanted to turn it into a vegetable garden. He walked next door and offered to buy it.
Give me your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden. I will give you a better one in exchange.
Or I will pay you whatever it is worth.
The Lord forbid that I should ever give you the sacred inheritance of my ancestors.
Naboth was respectful, but firm. To modern ears, he might just sound stubborn for turning down a lot of money. But in ancient Israel, land wasn't just real estate you could sell. It was a sacred inheritance given directly by God to each family. Selling it to a greedy king was a direct violation of God's law. Ahab could not handle being told no. He marched back to his palace, threw himself on his royal bed, turned his face to the wall, and stubbornly refused to eat his dinner. He was the king of the nation, acting exactly like a pouting child. Queen Jezebel walked into the bedroom.
Why are you sulking in bed like a child? Why won't you even sit up and eat your food?
Because Naboth the Jezreelite absolutely refused to sell me his vineyard for my garden.
Jezebel laughed coldly. She had no respect for Israel's laws, and she had no respect for a weak king.
Are you the king of Israel or not? Get out of bed and eat! I will get you the vineyard of Naboth myself.
Jezebel did not negotiate. She schemed. She wrote letters using the king's official seal and sent them to the corrupt leaders of the city. She ordered them to declare a public fast, put Naboth at the front of the crowd, and secretly hire 2 scoundrels to lie and say Naboth had cursed God and the king. The wicked plan worked perfectly. Innocent Naboth was dragged out of the city and brutally stoned to death. His precious vineyard was now totally abandoned. When Jezebel heard the terrible news, she smiled.
Get up, Ahab. Take possession of the vineyard. Naboth is no longer alive to stop you.
But heaven was not blind. God saw the wicked murder of innocent Naboth, and he immediately dispatched his greatest prophet to intercept the greedy king. Ahab eagerly jumped out of bed and hurried down to the vineyard to claim his stolen prize. He walked through the beautiful vines, admiring his new property. But waiting for him in the middle of the garden was a man in a camel hair coat. Ahab froze. The joy drained entirely from his face. It was Elijah.
So, you have finally found me, my great enemy. I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. You have murdered an innocent man and seized his property.
Elijah did not hold back. He delivered a crushing, terrifying prophecy of absolute justice. He declared that because of their wickedness, the entire royal family would be swept away. The vineyard of stolen joy became a courtroom of divine judgment. Ahab was so utterly terrified by Elijah's words that he tore his royal robes and put on rough cloth to show regret. Because of this brief moment of humility, God showed mercy and delayed the final destruction of Ahab's royal family. But true justice cannot be ignored. For his crimes, Ahab would still lose his crown, eventually dying by a stray arrow in battle. And eventually, Queen Jezebel met her own terrifying end, overthrown by her own servants and thrown out of her high palace window. About 10 years had passed since the fiery showdown on the mountain. With Ahab gone and the kingdom shifting, the time finally came for Elijah's earthly mission to conclude. He and his faithful student, Elisha, walked together toward the Jordan River. 50 other prophets stood on a nearby hill, watching them from a safe distance. Elijah took his heavy camel hair coat, rolled it up tightly, and struck the water with a loud slap. The river instantly split right down the middle, opening a perfectly dry path. The two men walked across the riverbed as the water formed a massive wall on either side. Once they reached the other shore, Elijah turned to his student.
Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken away into heaven?
Please, let me inherit a double share of your spirit and become your successor.
A double share didn't mean Elisha wanted to be twice as powerful. In ancient times, the double portion was the inheritance given to the oldest son in the family. Elisha was asking to be treated as Elijah's true spiritual son, taking on the heavy responsibility of his legacy.
You have asked a very difficult thing. But if you see me when I am taken from you, then you will safely get your request.
They continued walking, talking quietly together. Suddenly, the sky cracked open. A brilliant, blazing whirlwind dropped from the clouds. Right in the middle of the storm was a breathtaking chariot made entirely of bright, glowing fire, pulled by majestic horses made of pure flame. The flaming chariot rushed between the two men, violently separating them. The whirlwind caught Elijah, lifting the brave, tired, faithful prophet up into the sky. He did not die. He was simply carried alive, straight into the glorious presence of God. The ancient scriptures do not give us a direct explanation for why Elijah was taken this way instead of passing naturally. But the message is clear. Elijah's long, painful earthly battle was finally over. He didn't have to run from angry queens or hide in lonely caves anymore. God had come to bring his tired prophet safely home. Elisha stood on the ground, staring up at the clouds in absolute awe. His master was gone. But floating gently down from the sky, landing softly in the dirt, was the rough camel hair coat. Elisha walked over and picked it up. The mantle had been passed. The legacy would continue. Elijah's incredible story reminds us of a powerful truth. Even the greatest heroes can feel completely broken. Have you ever felt like Elijah sitting under that desert tree? Completely exhausted, overwhelmed by the world, and convinced that you are fighting your battles entirely alone. But look at how God responded to his tired prophet. He sent wild ravens to bring him meat. He gave an endless jar of flour to a starving widow to sustain him. He sent a glowing angel to bake him warm bread in the dirt. And most importantly, he revealed 7,000 other faithful believers fighting the exact same fight. You are never as alone as you think you are. God is always providing, always protecting, and always speaking, even if it is just in a gentle whisper. Since you made it all the way to the very end of this epic journey, congratulations. You have officially earned the Chariot of Fire badge. To lock in your badge today, type this exact phrase down in the comments. Faith of Fire. Thank you so much for watching. We love bringing these powerful biblical epics to life for you and your family. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe to see the next story. God bless.